In formulating their energy strategies, all countries face much the same challenge, addressing what is variously described as the trilemma, the three A's or the three E's. That is, seeking to achieve energy security, environmental protection, and economic efficiency at the same time. In addition, they are all parties, with the exception now of the United States, to the Paris Agreement on climate change, and for those countries in the European Union, all are involved in the development of an increasingly pan-European approach to energy policy and movements towards an energy union. So, at first sight, it might be expected that OECD countries will be following much the same energy policy. But, of course, this is far from the case. Look, there are two main differences for this. The first is that all countries have different resource bases, different geographies, different national priorities, and different political approaches. And this is reflecting the different attitudes to particular fuel sources. Look, for example, nuclear or coal. And these are important in some countries, but rejected in others. Less obviously, perhaps, is a further dimension of the trilemma, in that these factors and the balances between them change over time, yet energy policy is to a large extent about the long term. Energy investments like power stations, pipelines, terminals and grids are long-lived, and this increases the risk of asset stranding when policy changes. Furthermore, developments in one part of the energy sector can and do directly affect other parts. For example, the growth in renewable generation directly impacts the gas and coal markets by displacing these fuels and has significant indirect impacts as well. At any particular moment, a country is in many ways a prisoner of its past, with an energy asset base which may not be optimal for its current energy policy objectives, and policies which are responding either to past challenges or, increasingly frequently, to the unintended consequences of current ones. Many developed countries are facing this issue, and whilst it's not alone therefore, the UK is facing the challenges in a particularly acute form. On the one hand, it's been the most strongly committed country to market liberalisation over the longest period of time, and on the other, it's created a particularly rigorous environmental straitjacket for itself in the Climate Change Act. Energy policy in the UK has undergone a paradigm shift over recent decades, from the free market stance of the 1990s to the more interventionist measures of the 21st century. However, the two approaches have not been reconciled. Even as the government intervenes, it reaffirms its goal of creating a more competitive market. The contradictions are most apparent in the case of electricity, which has been the main focus of intervention to date. But to explain how the UK got into this limbo, a little history lesson is needed. As is well known, the UK was a pioneer in market liberalisation, in particular in energy, during the 1980s. The strongest expression of this view came in the early 1980s when Nigel Lawson, the then Secretary of State for Energy, described his role in the following terms. I do not see the government's task as being to try to plan for the future of energy production and consumption, rather to set a framework which will ensure that the market operates in the energy sector with a minimum of distortion. The timing was indeed fortunate. For such an approach during the 1980s and 1990s, energy markets were well supplied, prices were low, and the growth of gas meant the environmental objections were met more or less automatically. In short, there was little or no energy policy in the 1990s. But this golden age couldn't last. With the turn of the 21st century, problems started appearing. Markets got tighter, the UK moved from being an energy exporter to an energy importer, and rigorous emission restrictions started to bite. All this led to what many have seen as a paradigm change in UK energy policy, marking an emphasis and a move back to interventionism. By 2011, the word planning had come back into the official lexicon, and even the Economist newspaper, normally a firm believer in free markets, argued that UK faced a power crisis as a result of an almost criminal planning failure. The starting point for a more interventionist approach, particularly in the case of electricity, was the growing significance of greenhouse gas emissions. In 2000, the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution recommended a target of 60% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2050. This led to the publication in 2003 of the White Paper, Our Energy Future, which was the first attempt at an energy policy for some 20 years. It recognised that environmental concerns were henceforth going to be a major driver of energy policy. Nevertheless, it continued to rely mainly on market-led measures, plus a little support for renewables and carbon trading, which had been thought to be enough to deliver the reductions envisaged. Energy policies then started to come thick and fast. In 2006, the government had another go at long-term planning in its report, The Energy Challenge. And whilst it proposed a number of things, it mainly attempted to clarify the role of nuclear power. But the devil was in the small print. The document noted that the gap, the level of emissions reduction needed by 2020, had actually increased. In fact, it nearly doubled since 2003. In other words, even if the policies introduced just 3 years earlier had had any positive effect, they were now being swamped by the impact of market forces. However, the 2006 report also proved something of a false start. The government still claimed to be neutral on which plants and which fuel mix investors could choose to build, and did not set out the full case for nuclear. Greenpeace challenged the government on the grounds that it had shown bias and failed to offer the fullest possible information. This being said, the case for nuclear was compelling, but still left it to investors whether to choose to build or not, leaving open the question of what would happen if they chose not to. Momentum built up once again with the Climate Change Act of 2008, which set a target of an 80% reduction for greenhouse emissions by 2050, and required the government to come up with plans to meet this goal with a series of interim targets. This concentrated the government's mind wonderfully. One realisation was that markets alone would probably not be enough to address what had been described, admittedly colourfully, as the greatest and most wide-ranging market failure the world has ever seen. It was clear as well that additional support for renewable plants would be needed. However, intervening in markets has consequences. Investing in low carbon generation is not just a matter of slotting in one sort of power plant for another. The new sources have their own economic, technical and operational characteristics, and these change the whole dynamic of electricity systems. Indeed, a number of reports from Ofgem had already pointed to the problem, and after the 2010 general election, the government agreed on a package of electricity market reforms, namely feed-in tariffs for renewables to replace the former ROC's renewable obligation certificates, emission performance standards for new power plants designed to prevent the construction of unabated coal plants, and a floor price for carbon. As with all these things, these proposals took time to elaborate, and a further element was added in the Electricity Act 2013 in the shape of capacity markets. These were in effect designed to offset some of the impact of the proposed support for renewables. Adding zero marginal cost intermittent new sources reduces the income and operating hours of those existing conventional plants, making an investment unattractive and so creating a security risk. The capacity market was designed to encourage investment in conventional plant, therefore. Capacity markets have yet to prove themselves. In the first auctions, prices were lower than the government had forecasted, but this was mainly because they were in effect getting the wrong sort of capacity. Most of the participants were either old plants whose capital costs had already been written off, or new and environmentally unattractive diesel plants. The plants the government actually wanted, new-fired gas plants, did not feature significantly, leading the Secretary of State Amber Rudd in a so-called reset speech to make it clear that she would tweak the rules if necessary to produce the right result. In short, it's a muddle. The government's position seems to be that it wants to make market mechanism work, but only if they give the outcomes the policymakers desire. As regards nuclear, the future remains uncertain. Existing nuclear plants, even with life extensions, are due for retirement over the next couple of decades, and without new nuclear construction, it will be difficult to replace them with low-carbon generation, while still maintaining the power system's security. However, support for new nuclear has been complicated by a combination of politics and unfavourable economics. At the time, given that the government had made it clear that its view that nuclear was needed, and whilst developers had no compulsion to invest, the government's negotiating position was weak, and the deal eventually agreed was with EDF, at a price which looks high by comparison with current market prices or nuclear costs elsewhere. Even given all of that and the feed-in tariff and support structures, it's unclear whether the project will be completed on time because of the weakness both of European electricity markets and the strains on EDF's balance sheet. Perhaps the biggest failure of electricity market reform is it's not achieved what it set out to do. Electricity wholesale markets remain unreformed, but they're still based on marginal costs and the ability of price incentives to promote efficient generation, at a time when new generation sources are capital intensive and unable to operate flexibly in response to price signals. The result, and indeed it's across Europe, is a broken electricity system, weak power companies, power station closures and the growing need for state intervention. There's no exit strategy in the absence of true market reform. The situation is half planned, half market based, with the disadvantage of each. Many have argued that the UK's energy policy is not fit for purpose and it remains stuck in limbo. They suggest that the way forward is not clear for any of the fuels, possibly with the exception of coal. That the government is making all decisions about investment in power generation, but without a mechanism to optimise investment or generation. It is paying a high cost for low carbon sources whilst doing little to secure diversity, and there's no long-term view of electricity system development, despite the fact that all concerned now recognise that some planning is needed. Clearly, the government needs to decide if it's serious about markets, and if so, it should look at electricity market structures and at developing a coherent approach to the demand side and to new market-friendly policy instruments like carbon intensity targets. If it accepts that intervention is needed on a continuing basis, it needs to spell out clearly the way forward for nuclear, carbon capture and storage, gas and other sources, and develop an overall coordinated mechanism. Simply muddling through erratically according to the needs of the moment will not work out if the government is indeed committed to fundamental change in the electricity sector and the decarbonisation that this will involve.